Good morning. Good morning. This is convocation, it's not class. You can actually make eye contact and speak to me. It's fantastic. Welcome to convocation. This year we have been all over the map, literally, from speakers from South Sudan to right up the road, tackling all kinds of different issues. But today we come to a more personal journey. And our speaker today, Emma Lowe, will be talking about an Appalachian transition, being transgender in Eastern Kentucky. And Emma is a lifelong resident of Appalachia, having been born and raised in Pike County, Kentucky. She holds a Bachelor's of Arts in Religious Studies from Berea. Emma has worked primarily as a human services professional, devoting herself to serving young adults and underprivileged groups. She publicly came out as transgender on June 25th, 2018, and now seeks to open dialogue about the trans experience in rural communities. Last year, Emma spoke to our medical school students and did such a fantastic job. It created quite a buzz. And in one of those classes that are not hard sciences in the medical school, to get students to really engage, to me, is almost a miracle. So that was a wonderful experience. I want to put a shameless plug for next week. Next week, Bishop John Stowe, the Catholic Bishop of the Diocese of Lexington, will be here talking about leadership with a heart of love. Also, the thing he's most passionate about is human value in light of immigration. So, one personal comment. As a Presbyterian institution, and oftentimes as a clergy person who kind of goes out and seeks our speakers, some people might say, oh my goodness, there are certain topics that are off the table. I actually couldn't disagree more. I think that the Christian faith is all about deeply rooted love, because that's who God is. So Emma, today I'm so excited. Thank you for being vulnerable, kind of leading with your own personal experience, helping us see new paths of empathy. So the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. All right, good morning. Thank you all so much for joining me to hear my story today. I really appreciate that. Also thank Rob Music for inviting me. This was very kind of me. I appreciate the opportunity. And also congratulations. My understanding is this is 130 years of service to Eastern Kentucky. That is amazing. So big round of applause for yourselves. That's fantastic. Okay, so it's possible some of you may already know me. It's possible that some people around here may know me and not realize that. Because I actually used to work at Pike, but when I did, I look like this. Right? So, question today that we'll be going through is, how did that guy become the lovely lady standing before you? Well, bit of a long story, so to tell you that story, I have to tell you a couple of other stories. Does anybody know anyone who's transgender? Is anybody familiar with the transgender experience, things like that? Cool, that's wonderful. So there's often a portrayal in the media, a portrayal in standard TV, movies, that sort of thing, of this idea of someone knowing from the beginning that they're trans, knowing just at a very early age. You may be familiar with trans actors like Jazz Jennings, Cox, that this idea of from your early childhood, from your early teenage, you just knew that the person you were did not match the person that people thought you were. That's not always the case. I think that's also an important story to tell. That was not actually the case with me. So, it's very okay with me. This is one of my first public speaking experiences since coming out, so thank you for bearing with me. Now, essentially from a young age, I knew that there was something different, there was something off. I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was. Earliest experiences of being gender non-conforming, we'll say, was, let's say about when I was 3 or 4 years old. And I know I just said, oh, you said that you didn't know this from an early age. I didn't get there. You're welcome to laugh at me. So, about the age of 3 or 4, I was at my uncle's house, and we were doing some sort of family gathering. We were all dressed very nicely. I was a young child. I won't remember exactly why. Could be a holiday, Easter, could be a wedding, funeral, something of that sort. All I remember was that everyone was dressed very nice fancy. And one of my aunt cousins, a pretty little girl, was wearing this beautiful dress and came up to me and said, "You should tell me if I'm pretty." Well, who am I to deny that? And I said, "Yes, you look very pretty." And she smiled and beamed and said, "Thank you." And I said, "Well," I thought myself, my 3-year-old right now, he's in on that. I said, "Okay, you tell me that I'm pretty." She gets one knee and says, "No, boys aren't pretty. Girls are pretty. Boys are handsome." I think about that for a second. I drop my water. And I say, "I don't want to be handsome, I want to be pretty." Which, obviously, is a silly thing for a 3 or 4-year-old thing. And we know now that obviously boys can also be pretty. But the first time in my life that I really can recall experiencing that I don't meet those standards of being a boy. I knew there was something off about myself, and as I grew up, there was this dissatisfaction, this feeling of unease, this general, I know something is wrong, but I don't know exactly what. And I learned later in life there's a term for that, it's called dysphoria. General, basically what I just said, general unease or dissatisfaction with life in general. And most transgender people experience something called gender dysphoria, which is essentially that for their gender identity, how they see themselves. So, for a number of different reasons, my dad and I never really saw eye to eye on a lot of things, and it's because he's a very masculine guy. My dad is, worked in the mines and likes sports and works on cars and hangs drywall and spits and drinks beer and a man's man. You know what I'm talking about? And I was not. He wanted me to, play sports. I was on the academic team and in the drama club. So the types of things that I had this role model in my life for what it meant to be masculine, what it meant to be a man, and I knew early on in my whole life that didn't make sense to me. I didn't quite match up with that. So it was less this notion that I knew from an early age that I was, not a boy or that I was a girl, but that I didn't fit in with these typical notions of gender. And that's something I'd like to discuss a little bit today. I'm not going to go over all of these criteria here, but this is from the DSM-5. It is the manual that psychiatrists, psychologists, medical professionals use to diagnose mental health conditions. Now, the point I'd like to make is that being transgender is not in itself a mental health disorder, but gender dysphoria is. And ironically, the treatment for gender dysphoria is transition. Shocking, right? So I've talked a little bit about being transgender, but I haven't really explained you what that is. Let's go ahead and touch on that terminology. Essentially, transgender is an adjective, is a descriptor denoting a person whose gender identity does not match the gender they were assigned at birth. I was assigned male at birth within the trans community, we would shorten that to AMAB. And would later in life realize that doesn't quite match up for me. Sorry, do we need this for recording?
Say again? Do we need this for recording? We can try it out if you would, yeah.
If you don't mind, I just do a much better job speaking without holding a microphone. Sorry, I know that makes me a little uncomfortable. I hope this will be a little bit better for everybody. Can everyone hear me still just fine? Fantastic. Okay. So, where was I? Being trans is essentially that notion that how I saw myself did not match what people expected of me, what society expected of me, what I was assigned at birth. And, we're good. So, the opposite of that is cisgender, which I assume is what most people in this room probably identify as. This crazy notion that if you are assigned male at birth, you identify as male, or if you're assigned female at birth, that is okay with you. And that was a shocking concept to me, to know that that was how most people actually felt. And big thing I want to touch on with that is those terms are mutually exclusive in that you can't be both trans and cis, you're one or the other. There are a whole plethora of gender identities that fit in under the trans umbrella, or that trans fits in with those identities. We'll be touching on that a little bit later, but just want to go over some basic terminology before we get too far into my discussion. Now, as I had said, I grew up with this notion that in order to be a man, I needed to behave and act a certain way, and that never really meshed for me. I never really saw that in myself. So that incongruity, as I got older, sort of led to some bad negative feelings. I struggled with depression a lot as a teenager, and I actually, like a lot of folks in the trans community, idealized the idea of taking my own life. The idea that, like, if I wasn't here, would that really be so bad? Wouldn't it be better to not have to deal with this stuff all the time? And sadly turned to the ideas of self-harm. I wasn't a cutter, but I did pretty regularly as a teenager physically abuse myself. Like, I would sit in the bathroom and just sort of like physically strike myself, and it was coping mechanism, I suppose. This idea that I would stand there and I would look at myself in the mirror and I would say to myself, that person doesn't make sense to me. I would stare at my reflection and think, is that who people see when they talk to me, when people address me, when people like think of the person that I am? Is this the image that comes to mind? That doesn't make sense to me. And I never really knew why, but I just knew that was wrong. So touching on these topics, I always like to present alternatives. I just want to discuss Trans Lifeline, which is a fantastic organization. They provide a crisis hotline, which the number is right there. If you know of anyone that could use those services, I would greatly encourage it. They offer even financial resources for people who need to transition. But this was, late 90s, early 2000s in Eastern Kentucky, and we didn't have that sort of thing. And I was fortunate because one day when I was harming myself, the last time I was harming myself, my mom caught me. I thought she was gone or thought she was asleep or something like that, but she heard me and she came into the bathroom and saw me, and I was crying and she was crying, and it was not good. But then we talked. And she let me know that even if I didn't like myself, I didn't deserve to treat myself that way. Just being a person made me valuable, even if I couldn't see that. And that was something I hadn't really considered or thought about before. So I found myself presented with this notion that I don't like who I am, and I don't fully understand why. So a logical solution would be to figure out why, right? Obviously, it's not what I did. I ignored that. And you'll find that this is a pretty common theme for today. When I was fortunate enough to, when I went off to college, that I got into therapy, and I found some better techniques for managing my depression, for managing my tendencies for self-harm, figuring out ways that I could be okay with myself, but never really letting myself touch upon that core idea of why I felt that way in the first place. Found things to distract myself with: school, organizations, friends, dating. Actually ended up getting married right out of college. So I found all of these things to focus myself on instead of what my underlying problem was. This all sort of came to a head early on in my marriage, and this is the fun part where Rob's going to get mad at me. We were newlyweds, and as most newlyweds do, we were interested in exploring and experimenting and trying new things. And she asked me one night, "Do you ever have any fantasies, anything wild that you'd like to try?" And the first thing I thought to say, and I didn't really know, I'd never thought about it before, first thing out of my mouth was, "I'd like to dress as a girl." And shockingly, my wife was okay with that, which was pretty fantastic for me at the time. Leads me to this idea of, we touched on it before, gender identity, the personal sense, understanding of your own gender. I was stuck in this mode at the time of thinking I was a man, I was a male, but gender identity is just one piece of the puzzle. There's also gender expression, which is the social, cultural component, how we view people of certain genders. It goes into things like dress, mannerisms, social roles, things like that. So I found myself in this situation where I had admitted and attempted to try what it would be like to dress as a woman, but still identified internally as a man. And this is part of the story where everybody goes, "So this is where you figured it out, right, that you were trans?" No, of course not. Me, a guy who likes dressing as a woman, I'm just a weird guy, right? So I stop and figure out some other things to focus on. Work, and we moved back. We were living in central Kentucky at the time, moved back here to eastern Kentucky. I got a new job working with Pike and threw myself into that and focused on that. Instead of, again, that underlying cause, what was the problem? Why did I feel this way? The tipping point for me, ironically, was actually social media. After a few years, I got involved on the website Tumblr, which more or less defunct now, but it gave me this opportunity to open up and see how other people lived, see other people's experiences. It's a blogging platform. People can basically post whatever they want. I joined there for completely different reasons, but just being there exposed me to seeing other people's perspectives, hearing other people's stories. And I saw a lot of things that were familiar to me. A lot of people talking about how they never felt right in their own skin, how they never felt right in their own bodies, how they didn't like the reflection, how they never matched up with typical social expectations of their gender. And I still very distinctively remember the night, lying in bed, scrolling through my phone, my wife asleep next to me, and I'm just scrolling and reading these stories for hours and hours into the wee morning, and I stopped. I looked at my phone, and I said, I think I might be a girl. So what then? What did I decide to do about it then? If you're paying attention to this story, nothing. I didn't do anything. I ignored it. But it started opening my eyes to this idea that gender was more of a spectrum. It wasn't this hard and fast rule that I had been raised to think that it was. Sort of like how modern science, modern medicine is trying to understand human sexuality. We used to think that the default was you're straight, and if you're not straight, there's something wrong with you. But we've come to understand more recently that that's not exactly the way things work. It's more of a spectrum. On the one side you have straight, which it would be a person who's attracted to someone of the opposite or a different gender. And on the other side of the spectrum, you have gay or someone who is same gender attracted. But the way spectrums work is there's all this area in the middle. So why would my wife, who married a man, be so okay with me wanting to dress as a woman? Because she was somewhere on that sexuality spectrum. My wife identified as bisexual, eventually took the term pansexual because that made more sense to her. And we're finally getting to the point where modern medicine, modern science is catching up to this notion of what it means, that gender is similarly on a spectrum. Some people identify as strongly masculine, some people identify as strongly feminine, but there's all this space, this area in between. You can be non-binary. I have family members and friends who don't really connect with either gender, with either masculine or feminine. Gender fluid, this idea that sometimes you identify as a man, sometimes you identify as a woman, sometimes it's a weird area in between. All of these can be thought of as gender non-conforming identities that break from that traditional mold of masculine and feminine. You even have crazy ideas like off-the-wall that aren't even on the gender. Agender, this notion that you don't identify with the gender at all. This was radical thinking to me. This is this brand new idea that just because I was born a certain way doesn't mean I have to be that way. So, one day, after coming home from work, I sat down with my wife and I say, I think, you remember when I tried cross-dressing a few years ago? And she said, yeah, that's fine. Bother me. I said, yeah, well, I think I might actually be a woman. I think I'm actually transgender. And fortunately, she said, that's okay. We'll figure it out. We'll make this work. Very fortunate to have that happen. So, in the trans community, there are 3 major avenues of transition. And not everyone follows these to the letter or to the T. But there are 3 major ways that people go about transitioning. First would be a social transition, where you actually begin living as your gender. These changes could involve things like changing your name, changing the pronouns, changing how you dress, changing how you ask people to refer to you. I'd come out to my wife, and I knew that this was something about who I am. So this was the next step, right? No, of course that's not that. I stayed in the closet because I was scared. How many people here are from Eastern Kentucky, from Appalachia, or born and raised in this area? I probably don't have to tell you that Eastern Kentucky has not always been the most progressive place. Shocking, I know. For example, my next door neighbor flies the rebel flag. Great. I've spoken to people who actively voted against marriage equality. I know of individuals who were very upset of the idea that we had a black man as president. This notion of coming out in this area terrified me. Talked about my dad earlier. He wasn't crazy about the idea that I would rather act than lift weights or play basketball. How was he going to react to find out that I was nearly 30 years old and wanted to be a woman? So I stayed in the closet. And I slowly started talking to a few people every now and then. I talked to my mom, came out to her. She was thankfully very supportive of me. The night I told her, she looked me dead in the eye and said, there's nothing that you can do or say or be that'll make me love you any less. I was very grateful for that because from my experiences of researching online, I knew that a lot of people did not get that opportunity. A lot of people didn't have that. I started talking to my friends and explaining to them that this is who I thought I was. And by and large, they were okay with it. They handled it well. But I still didn't feel ready to come out publicly. That leads us to the next avenue of transition, medical transition, which is the idea that you go through some sort of medical procedure in order to better identify as your gender. Could be things like hormone therapy, could be surgery, several avenues for this. So, me being the very smart individual this story has painted me out to be, decided that instead of coming out and telling people and announcing publicly this is who I am, this was the steps I was going to take, I decided I'm going to try the second step before I try the first step. So I go see a therapist. I save up money actually to go see one. As those of you who are in this area probably know, there's not a lot of people who specialize in gender theory here in Pike County. I saved up, I paid for a 3-hour therapy session and drove to Louisville, 4-hour drive, spent the night, and all the next day I talked to her about a lot of the things I've talked to you all about today. And she agreed with me actually, weirdly enough. She said, yeah, you're transgender, you're not a guy. Oh, great, I was right. Eventually. And she agreed that transitioning would help me. So she made an appointment for me with UK Healthcare, and that summer I saw an endocrinologist and went through some tests, and eventually I started hormone replacement therapy, which is essentially hormone supplements to make my body match what a typical cisgender woman's hormone levels would be. Take an estrogen supplement, take a testosterone blocker, things like that. I knew from my research that was the path I wanted to follow. I knew that was right for me. Because I was the only person I knew that was like this. I didn't know anyone in my immediate vicinity. I wasn't friends with any trans people. So I started doing that. And the cool thing about hormone therapy is that it changes your body. The bad thing about hormone therapy for someone still in the closet is it changes your body. So there I am, a man working with high school students, presenting as a man, undergoing the gender expression of a man who was growing his hair out, and face was gradually getting rounder and less of a strong jaw, who started growing breasts, and eventually my hand got forced. I spent all of my life trying to avoid my problems instead of actually facing them. And then the thing about that is your problems eventually face you. It started to get very difficult to hide that. So finally I bit the bullet and I came out publicly. Like Rob mentioned earlier, June 25th, 2018, I announced it publicly in the best and most efficient forum that we have in the modern era, Facebook. It was the easiest way to get to the most people at the same time. And I wrote a big long post on my Facebook page. I created a brand new page as Emma instead of my old name. And I waited. And people started sending me friend requests and started messaging me. And people just started coming out of the woodwork. Friends that I hadn't spoken to since high school were sending me messages and saying, congratulations, proud of you. I've been really happy for you. And people told me I was brave. And a big part of this story for me is that I don't really see myself as brave. If I was brave, I would have faced my problems back when I was a teenager and realized that, hurting myself meant that there was some problem. I was brave early on in my marriage when I realized that I enjoyed dressing as a woman. I would have confronted that. If I was brave when I first accepted the idea that I might not be the person that I spent my whole life thinking I was, I would have done something about it then, but I didn't. So I guess, speaking to a room full of non-trans, full of cisgender people, that would be the thing I hope you take away today, is that you can't run from your problems. You can try. You can run for almost 30 years, in fact. But they catch up to you. Now, my public coming out went really well, for the most part. Some of the friends I had on my old Facebook page stopped talking to me and didn't add me on the new one. They thought what I was doing was weird. In one instance, a friend I had from high school started spreading rumors that I had flown out of the country to have breast implants, which is absurd. I was scared of what would happen to me if I transitioned. And then those things started happening. Towards the end of 2018, the beginning of 2019, my wife of over 10 years, we decided that we needed to end our marriage. No one's fault, really. There's no one reason that a marriage ends, but if I could put it succinctly in a 30-minute talk to a group of people at UPike, I would have to say that it's because she thought she married a man. And in her defense, I did too. So we got divorced, and I lost my job. And I haven't been able to find one since, despite the fact that there's plenty of opportunities available. Job postings every day. I apply to jobs multiple times a week. Since I was no longer married to my wife, it made sense that I wouldn't keep living in her house, so I lost my home, my career. Everything that I had spent my life working for was basically gone. You probably think, well, this isn't good. She hurt herself as a child. She was depressed. This probably put her in like the darkest place of her life. Weirdly, no. I like myself better than I ever have before. But I spent all those years running from my problem, all this time trying to avoid my problems and not face them. And when they faced me and I was forced to deal with who I was, yeah, bad things happened, but I turned out okay. I'm also one of the fortunate ones because I haven't been a victim of violence, which is very common among transgender women. A number gets quoted quite often that the average life expectancy for a transgender woman of color is 35 years, which scares me. Ultimately leads me to the third type of transition, the last thing that I needed to do, legal transition. Basically, changing your name, changing your government IDs, things like that, going through the legal processes of finalizing all the changes that I had been through. That stuff costs money, did you know?